I think the run is going to be established so hard with the Jets this year.
Welcome to another edition of the SumerSports Show with a specific theme for the day, one I am passionate about and one that is top of mind for many of you at this time of the year, and that is fantasy football. We at Sumer love roster building. It's at the heart of what we do, and I think many of the lessons that we learn when thinking about real-life roster building are also lessons that are applicable to fantasy roster building, which in many ways is an exercise in maximizing value. So we've got two guys here today who are particularly well-suited to tell us how to maximize that value in Sam Bruchhaus, our senior data scientist here at Sumer, and Tej Seth, one half of our Stats and Scheme newsletter combo with Sean Syed, a newsletter that you can subscribe to now. We've got links up on all of our social media feeds. Tej, I'm excited to have you on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me on today. Really excited to talk to you guys. Should be a really fun time, just like getting deep in the weeds on fantasy football strategies.
Yeah, don't hold back. I want all of the nerdiness to come out here, guys. There are fantasy analysts all over the place that have thoughts on which running back or which tight end or whatever. I want all of the deep data goodness that you guys can bring to the table. Sam, let's start with, where do you start? Like, you specifically, with all of the information that you have about what's important, what's not important, where do you start when you're thinking about how to approach a fantasy draft?
The place where I started this year was trying to figure out which of the top 5 guys I was really, really interested in. And this is even before, depending on what league you're in, like if you're in a league where you get to pick your spot, or you're in a lottery, or if you're the worst, you're number 1, and so forth and so on. So let's just get past that. It seemed as if there was a certified top group this year, and that was Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson, Bijan Robinson, Saquon Barkley, and Jahmyr Gibbs. And I think when you know that those 5 will go off the board 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I don't know how many leagues that wasn't the case in. You really want to parse out what you want to do with that. And I think this year, the most important one, and we have all talked about this quite a bit, was the difference between the running back position and the wide receiver position. So I'm really interested to see what Tej has to say about those differences more generally and this year as well.
Yeah, so I was very similar to you there, Sam, where I always start from the top and work my way down. And this year, as I was going through my usual process, it surprised me that running back in the first round seemed like a viable strategy again. And I think it's a combination of a couple things, where we've had these past couple years where every single year, someone in your home league would find out about zero RB and they would implement that strategy, and it would probably be the optimal strategy. And the home league would just get tougher and tougher because of that. And then eventually, like, too many of them knew about that strategy, and you kind of have to like look at different strategies to do in the first round. I'm back to being a hero RB guy, where you have all these running backs at the top that are going to get a high percentage of their team's rushes and probably be pretty efficient with those rushes. You have Saquon Barkley, Bijan Robinson, Jahmyr Gibbs. Then you go to like the next tier with like Genty and Devon Achane and players like that. And so I like came back to being a running back in the first round guy, like I was when I first started doing fantasy drafts when I was 10 years old. And I've reverted back to that mentality.
Let me break down when it makes sense to go zero RB and when it makes sense to go RB in this case, or hero RB. Like, what are you looking for in the entirety of a draft field to decide which is the right strategy in a given year?
Yeah, I mean, you never want to lock yourself into one specific strategy and start reaching because of it. But I see this as more of like a general outline to follow in your fantasy drafts. And what it comes down to for me is where the replacement level is at for each position. And I see replacement level in fantasy as the first player to be drafted that won't be in a starting lineup. So if you're in a league with 12 teams that has 2 running back slots and no flex, that would be RB25, because he would be the first player to not be in a starting running back spot. And so then from there, you can really look at how much value is every player above that replacement level player adding above, what we project that player to get to. And this year we're seeing an opportunity where the replacement level running backs are a little bit lower, just because we've seen a shift in terms of these like workhorse running backs, like just being the running backs that are going to get a high percentage of their carries. And so the like handcuff running back just isn't what it was these past couple of years. And so I think that's why it's pushed these top running backs higher up in the first and second rounds for users to be able to draft them.
Yeah, and I'm glad Tej mentioned the kind of handcuff running back strategy, because that was how a lot of people made, their bones the last couple of years. And you look at some of the high value handcuffs, and that just doesn't necessarily exist today. I think the biggest person that people are going to try to handcuff, particularly if they're drafting in the end of the first round, will be Christian McCaffrey. And like, which 49ers running back are you going to pick? I don't think a lot of people were selecting Jordan Mason super highly last year. And I know people definitely weren't even considering that Isaac Garando would have had a spike game or two by the end of the year. And I think it's just become so difficult to select those handcuff running backs unless the running back is not a good running back or not a certified running back one in fantasy leagues, that it's just not as a viable strategy. And as a result, as Tej says, when you start breaking it down, whether you have a model or whether you're just looking at rankings, the value over the worst starter is just not quite there for these kind of mid-tier handcuff running backs as it is for those super duper top tier hero running backs.
Well, and there's a difference too now that I think has become we're getting more and more in a direction where we're seeing more committee running backs as opposed to just clear cut handcuff running backs. And the two are different to a degree, right? Like, you're not handcuffing Jahmyr Gibbs with David Montgomery, right?
Right. Yeah.
And
No, that's exactly
actually
true.
explain your approach to that, because you do have guys in two backfields that are already going to have standalone fantasy value of different, values, certainly. But how do you approach that? Like, if you do get a Jahmyr Gibbs, do you want David Montgomery also, or do you specifically not want David Montgomery also? How do you want to handle those types of situations?
Yeah, no, I think you brought up like two really interesting points there. Like the first one with, kind of these shared backfields. You look at an example like the Broncos this year with like RJ Harvey and JK Dobbins, where it's like when you do go hero RB and you spend your first round pick on a running back, you can kind of stack your receivers if you want to go quarterback, tight end after that, and then pick up one of those shared running backs, in like the fifth, sixth round, and that kind of can complete your starting running back group there. So like I think that's like a very viable strategy, and again, why you can go out and do something like stud RB with a RB that's in a shared backfield. But when it comes to like stacking running backs in particular that are on the same team, I'm usually pretty against that, just because when you're playing fantasy football, you're chasing the championship game, and there's really no difference if you finish fourth versus 11th. I don't want to say 12th, because I know some leagues have a punishment, but no difference between finishing fourth and 11th. So like I think that just kind of limits your ceiling when you have both Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery, just because like there's a limited amount of touchdowns to go around. There's a limited amount of big like high leverage carries to go around with those guys.
And I want to highlight something that Tej said that I think both applies to the running back position and to the way that I think all three of us approach fantasy more generally, which is the word variance. When you have kind of this wide tail distribution that you're fighting for, in that you're either first or last kind of to a certain degree, or you don't really care if you're second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, so forth and so on, that allows you to kind of seek out variance, particularly in the running back room. And that was basically the background of the zero RB strategy more generally, was that we know that running backs are so variant. So why would you bet on these hero running backs? But now that we're in a situation, particularly in 2025, where there's probably going to be 4, 5, 6 running backs that we know of that are rookies that will be getting snaps, that you can also kind of draft in the middle or late rounds, all the way down to a guy that I know all three of us love, Ja'Cory Krosky-Merritt, who is getting considered for snaps with the Washington Commanders and is really not even getting drafted in 10-team leagues. you can play the
Yet.
variance of the running back position in the late rounds while also playing for the big guys in rounds 1 and 2. And I don't think that has really existed in past years, but I think it's a unique situation in 2025 where there's not a ton of handcuff running backs. There's a couple committee running backs. There's a bunch of big running backs, and then there's a bunch of rookie running backs, and you can play the variance there instead.
It does feel like the group of names at the top at running back that I can trust does feel bigger this year.
Mm-hmm.
Is that just me, or do you think that that is statistically true in terms of guys that we're expecting to consistently at least get consistent opportunity to put up high point totals?
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. Like, I didn't see that often in past years. I was very big on going wide receiver in the first like 2-3 rounds in previous seasons, but this year I am still okay taking wide receiver round 1, but I'm taking a running back in round 1 more often than I did in the past, just because you have this combination of guys who will have a high percentage of their team's carries paired with a pretty high efficiency and goal line work as well, which is basically like everything you're looking for in your RB1. And just like when I did my own points over replacement, I ended up having 6 running backs in the top 10. So like Saquon Barkley, Bijan, Gibbs in kind of like that tier 1. And then Derrick Henry, Christian McCaffrey, Ashton Genty, and Devon Achane kind of in that tier 2 there. So just like it just gets you like really, really excited to have one of those guys and then stack up your receivers later in the draft once you secure your first running back slot.
How do you discern the difference between tier 1 and tier 2 for you? Like when you break those names out into a tier 1 and tier 2, Tej, I'm interested to know what the differentiating factor is in terms of determining who goes where.
Yeah, I mean that is a really good question. It's usually a little bit more vibes based when it comes to making that myself. It's just kind of like I see the tier 1 as guys who will be a major part of their offense, and they don't have basically like any concerns other than the standard injury rate that happens for running backs. And then tier 2, I kind of see this year as like Derrick Henry. He is getting older, even though he always overcomes the age curve. It seems like Christian McCaffrey, had the injury issues last year. Ashton Genty, rookie, and then Devon Achane, you're just gonna be hoping that his receiving production kind of stays up. So those are guys like I still really want to draft in the first round, but that I have like one concern about relative to Saquon, Bijan, and Gibbs, where I don't really have any concerns about them.
Yeah, and Tej says it's vibes based, and I think that's fair in that there's not a set formula to fill the tiers, but there is like a visual kind of component to this. And I was always a big proponent of using rankings because if you're in a home league, if you're in a family league, something like that, that's what everyone realistically is using, probably whatever the platform rankings are. But what this year I've really fallen into is looking at the actual point total or the actual, even down to the statistical level, to see what the plateaus are at different levels. And when you're talking about a Jahmyr Gibbs who plans to be a massive part of the pass game, Devon Achane came up in that conversation as well, Bijan Robinson as well. The plateau for those players is just substantially higher than rushing only players, more like Saquon or like Derrick Henry. And while you do want to, keep in your brain that Saquon had 2,000 rushing yards last year, it's just not as easy to do that only through the ground game without the passing game or involvement elsewhere. And so when you really do break it down to the actual statistical level or to the total points level, wherever you may be getting your point projections from, there is like a visual element, particularly if you start looking cross position, where you're like, oh, it's clear that this player probably has higher upside than this other group of players, despite that other group of players also being very good.
I think in terms of tiers, like at the top, I'm looking for, taking the running backs as an example, I'm looking for somebody who checks all of these boxes, and that is elite talent. Like in some scenario, they have the talent to be the overall RB1, right? Like, well, ultimately, that's the overarching theme of what I'm looking for in my tier 1. Is there a scenario that is realistic, where this person is RB1. And there's a lot of people in the league for which this is not true, right? Like you can be like, hey, I'm high on that person's floor and I think they might have a ceiling. Like, are they really going to leap over any of these names? Probably not. So there's a small group of people that I think are really in that conversation. Are they actually good running backs? Like, is there evidence? And we have, our Sumer scores or however you want to decide that. Are they actually talented? And we talk a lot about running backs being hard to discern whether or not they're actually talented or their environment. But I think that there are a handful of people in the league that we know are actually very, very good. Is the opportunity going to be great within this offense? And then is the offense good? Is the environment good? So that there are fewer paths to failure for these people. For me, you've mentioned Achane a few times. I'm putting Achane in my tier 2 because he doesn't check all of those boxes for me. Like, I think he's very, very good in the passing game. His rushing efficiency was terrible last year. Now, is that environmental? I don't know, but that also points to questions about the offense, and you can see the floor falling out and it all kind of like going to crap. There's a path to failure there that doesn't feel the same as everybody else that I put in that tier. GNT is another one, but that kind of brings up almost like a risk aversion question and where the risk is okay to attach. Because I know, Sam, you talked about you kind of want to chase risk in certain parts of the draft. For me, I don't want to chase risk in round 1 because there's too many other options that check all of the boxes that I talked about. So why would I take on the unknown of a rookie running back specifically there? Even though the upside might be incredible, you're talking about taking that or Amon-Ra St. Brown or that or, like a Christian McCaffrey, or I understand that Christian McCaffrey has some question marks attached to him too, but where do you feel comfortable in a draft taking on risk and where do you not feel comfortable with that?
I mean, yeah, it's another really good point to bring up with the risk. And I've always seen it as something that your openness to taking on risk should increase as the draft goes along. Like just from like just from your perspective of like how much fun it is to have your fantasy team throughout the year, like it hurts so badly when your first round pick doesn't work out. Like it's just like it just completely ruins your fantasy season. So like I do like going higher floor and maybe like lower ceiling in rounds 1 and 2. And then when you start to work towards the back of the draft, like that's where you can start to take on players like Chris Olave, for example, where like you have no idea what his quarterback situation is going to look like. You have no idea what his health situation is going to look like, but he is such an efficient route runner when he's on the field. And so like you can be okay taking on that risk in rounds 4, 5, and 6 because you got higher floor guys earlier in the draft.
And I think this year is unique because even getting into the 3rd or 4th or 5th round, and this is kind of a bigger strategy as well, you're starting to see players slip due to suspensions or due to like some weird preseason injuries that I think can really take advantage of in rounds 3, 4, or 5. Like in particular, I had a draft that I did where AJ Brown fell into the early part of the 3rd round. AJ Brown, if you have looked at any of our target share and yards per route run graphs, is at the absolute far right. And obviously there's environmental factors in that. The Eagles last year were massively low in pass rate over expected, but that's not necessarily going to be the case this year. And I think the NFC East is probably rebuilt a little bit, and the Giants are looking better, the Cowboys are looking better, so forth and so on. And so you can't really count on some of that stuff. And when you look at a player who has immense sticky stats, who's just been like questionable and not practicing for, I think it's 9 days at this point, you can still grab a ton of value in an 18-week season from that player, particularly in the 3rd or 4th round. And I think you look at guys like Rashee Rice, who is facing a suspension question mark at a later date. We're not sure. This was something that happened with Alvin Kamara, I think 2 years ago, where he didn't even end up getting suspended. And all of a sudden you had an apex fantasy player on your team that you got in the middle rounds. So if there are players that are risk averse in terms of their statistics, but there are elements maybe off the field or injury wise that aren't, super concrete, but they're falling because of those. I think there's also a way to play the variance that way in kind of the earlier rounds, not necessarily rounds 1 or 2. But you can also play it that way to get some really good players.
Do you want to spread the risk out too? Is that part of it? Like if you start to build, let's say you did take Ashton T in the first round, then does that impact whether or not you have the luxury of taking that swing on someone in the third or fourth round? Like, is there any kind of mathematical component to this in terms of like how much risk is too much risk?
I definitely think so. Like I think from our perspective as people who play in multiple fantasy leagues, like I think I'm in 8 this year. I know that's a small fraction compared to what you're in, Lindsay, but like it's easier for us to take on risk because if one of our teams just isn't good, like we have other teams to focus on. I think when it comes to people who, you know, we grew up with, like we're friends with, like people who just play in 1 or 2 fantasy leagues, like it's a little bit different of a problem for them to figure out like how they want to spread out their risk. And I think like when you're building out each position group of your fantasy team, you want to pair it with more dependable players and high risk within the position. You don't want to do like a receiver room that's all risky players while the rest of your team is not, because like you're going to need receivers to start later in the season, and you might just have no one there if you go all in on the risk. So I really do like if you do take someone like Genty, who I guess has like a little bit more inherent risk baked in to him, like taking like a very consistent player with like a lower ceiling like James Conner later in the draft to like pair together, I think can like work out pretty nicely.
So I think you're starting to get into something that's really hard, or at least in prior years has been really hard for me to differentiate, Tej. And I think this year it's a little clearer, and we've touched on that, but how to build out the team and when to switch from, okay, there's a really good wide receiver on the board, but I definitely need a running back here. Is there kind of a way that you try to wade through that as you go through the rounds, or is it just more of a feel thing based on the league?
Yeah, I mean that's like a really good point to bring up there as well. And it's definitely something I've noticed myself doing when I do best ball drafts is, you know, if I'm in a situation where I've already drafted 3 receivers, I'm like, oh, I should take a running back here because like there's no one in that slot right now. And so I think like it is fine to start to like upgrade a position group that you have like less resources in as you go later in the draft. Just from like a feel perspective, just to like get some players at that position in. I think when you're in a redraft league, it's okay to start to like put players on your bench like relatively early in the draft
Mhm.
because injuries are going to happen. You know, start sit variance is going to happen, and you have like the tool of the trade, right? Like if you end up weak at running back but strong at receiver because you have a good receiver on your bench, like week 1 or 2, you can always trade the team that really needs the other position that's stacked at the position that you're weak at, and that can work out there pretty nicely as well.
This is, I think, the toughest thing for me, and I would imagine other people too, is understanding that you really want to maximize the value of every pick, but you literally can put yourself in a position if a run happens, you just can't get left out. And so I find myself quite often in drafts, especially when I think when you're playing in with people who are different skill levels than you are, so that you have a harder time predicting how the draft is going to go. Those are the drafts that I find to be the hardest in this sense, where you're like, okay, normally let's say I'm playing in an experts draft and we're all kind of on the same page about where quarterbacks are going to start coming off the board, for instance. And then you go to a home league draft and all of a sudden the quarterbacks are gone. Like there's just a run and you're like, well, I don't like this guy better than the running back or wide receiver that's available here. But if I wait too much longer, I'm literally just going to be left out in the cold at quarterback. So I think that's one of the toughest challenges of fantasy drafts, is knowing when you do need to just fill the slot and just give up the value, or when you want to just take advantage of the fact that they're zigging and zag in a different direction,
Mhm.
take the value pick there, and then just make up for it later. I'm wondering how you guys handle those situations when they come up.
I think in particular this year, and I'm interested in Tej's thoughts on this. This is most applicable to the tight end position because it feels like this is a 3 tight end year where it's Trey McBride, George Kittle, and Brock Bowers. So Tej, how are you approaching that in particular with respect to, if once someone drafts Trey McBride, George Kittle is probably going to come off the board and Brock Bowers is probably already off the board.
Yeah, I mean, it's been really interesting to see how the tight ends have been drafted this year because it's something we've texted about a lot as the three of us. Where if you don't get one of those top three tight ends, you can just wait until like pick 100, like much later in the draft to just get like the one of the last tight ends of the next tier, just because like that first tier is so much further ahead than the rest. And when it comes to drafting one of those top three tight ends early in particular, like I've always been someone that likes to wait on tight ends, which is just like a personal preference because I know that I only have to start one tight end. If the tight end I draft late doesn't work out, I can maybe find someone on the waiver wire. You always have kind of that outlet just in case. But I trust the market is smarter than me. And so to see Bowers and McBride have ADPs that are in like the low to mid 20s right now is a signal to me that having one of those guys is going to be so helpful throughout the season because the gap between the top three tight ends and tight end 13 right now is massive. And so when you can go and get one of those elite tight ends and not even have to think about that position for the rest of the draft, I think that there is something there in terms of drafting one of those tight ends higher this year than how I felt about that in the past.
I feel like with the tight end position this year, there are a few that are going later that I like. And so for me, I agree that getting one of those top three is smart strategy and that there's a big drop off. It gets so muddy right away after those top three. There's so much question that we can attach to them in terms of the value of taking them where they're going in the draft. Like, I just don't necessarily like it compared to the other positions that you could be checking in that range. And so I think it's important to identify somebody later that you like. Like for me, I like Zach Ertz. I like Zach Ertz where he's going in terms of the opportunity. I think he's likely to get what he has consistently done in the past. I don't think that his ADP necessarily matches his role in the offense. I think we've just decided he's too old and we're done. Like, so it doesn't match in my mind. And so I'm fine waiting on him, which means that I might have to reach for him a little bit once we start getting close to him. And I'll also have to be super aware of who I'm drafting with and whether anybody else has him identified as a guy to go. But I actually think that this is tougher for me with the quarterback position because at quarterback, the runs are likely to happen once somebody takes Josh Allen or Lamar, like those top four, typically people follow it. And so those four are likely to go. And then my guess is that Joe is also likely to go also. I feel like there's another tier break after Baker Mayfield, probably like Bo Baker in that range. And then it gets tricky. So for me, I think quarterback is harder because I have been in drafts where I've been like, okay, big run on quarterbacks in the third round, for instance. I was in a draft where it literally were like 7 of 9 picks. They just went, boom, we're all gone. And so before it even got to me at the end of the round, like I didn't have a chance. And I was looking at grabbing Baker. But so then I had a problem there where I was like, don't like Baker here compared to everybody else, but I'm on the end. And so a whole lot, like we could be done with quarterbacks by the time it comes back to me. Whereas I feel like tight end, there is so much volatility with tight end on a week-to-week basis. Like there's always guys, like you mentioned, maybe even streaming tight ends. There are always guys every week that finish in the top 5 that feel entirely random. Like Will Dissly at the end of the year last year. You could pick him up on waivers, you could plug him in, and he might be a top 5 tight end that week. So, but I'm not sure that that's true in a way that we can identify at quarterback. So I feel like quarterback is a really tough one in terms of like when to get in if you miss that first run.
I do think you're right about that. When it comes to quarterbacks, like it's been kind of similar for me where like, again, you only have to start one every week in a one quarterback league. Obviously Superflex becomes a little bit different, but just for like one quarterback leagues, like I'm okay not drafting any of the top 8 guys and just taking that next tier that has some like really good rushing upside to it. Like you have Kyler Murray as QB9, you have Justin Fields as QB11, Caleb Williams as QB14, and Drake May as QB16. And so like those are the guys that I've just been drafting a lot of this summer because like I can see them going out and getting like at least 20, but maybe even more rushing yards per game. And I am sitting on here with the biggest fan of the QB designed rush in the world, probably with Sam Bruchhaus. So I'm sure he's excited about that as well.
Yeah, I think to kind of pull some of the things we've been talking about, the merit this year of the running back hero strategy, or the running back 1-2 strategy, is that it kind of forces you to consider where you want to take tight ends and where you want to take quarterbacks. And where I've been has been a similar place as Tej, whether that's in auction drafts where I'm considering where I should allocate funds, or in just normal snake drafts, in that I've always felt like even if there was a run on quarterbacks late, I could still get one of the following three players: Brock Purdy, Bo Nix, or Kyler Murray, all of which have some rushing upside. Brock Purdy probably has the least rushing upside, even though he did increase his scramble rate from about 3% to 8%, and is now one of the more scrambly quarterbacks in the league at this point, at least as it pertains to last year. And I think when you have a cluster of those guys where you feel comfortable that, 6 of the 10 teams will already have an option at quarterback, and maybe you were able to better address the high scoring positions of wide receiver and running back, that is what I have kind of found comfort in the 2025 fantasy preseason, which is that there's these clusters of quarterbacks, and you can even get down into like Jared Goff, who threw for a ton of yards last year, or Jordan Love, who I think a lot of people love in Green Bay this year, given all of the assets that have been spent on pass catchers in the past couple of years in Green Bay, where you can still see them performing really well in the passing game, or that tier above, you can see them having some rushing upside, but you're not necessarily having to take them in the third or fourth round as you might with Lamar Jackson or Josh Allen, who of course are sure to just simply win weeks for you by themselves.
You guys are talking a lot, more so, Tej, the examples that you gave towards the end of the draft were all rushing quarterbacks. How much does that lower the variance, and how much do we need to be wary of even some of the better quarterbacks who do not have that rushing upside, like a Joe Burrow or maybe a Baker Mayfield, some of those guys? How do you decide what's likely to happen to them and where their floor is?
When you look at the quarterbacks that have rushing upside, the reason why I like drafting them is because of the spike weeks that Sam was just talking about, where when Justin Fields was with the Bears, there would be, maybe like once a month, he would have a play where he had like a 40, 50-yard rushing touchdown. And that's just like so huge in terms of fantasy points, because that gets you like 8, 9 fantasy points right there in one play. And like quarterbacks, when they were throwing deep passing touchdowns, just like can't generate that type of explosiveness. And so that's really why I just like getting those quarterbacks with rushing upside in there, because rushing touchdowns are worth 2 more points than passing touchdowns, and then rushing yards are worth a decent amount more than passing yards in most leagues. When it comes to quarterbacks that don't necessarily have that rushing upside, then you just look for like the hyper efficient passers. Sam mentioned like Baker, Jared Goff, like those are quarterbacks that ranked very highly in something like EPA per play last season, because their drop back offenses were just so efficient. So like they'll put up yards and passing touchdowns. And you just have to hope that depending on the week, they end up throwing for 3 passing touchdowns more so than 1, because then you get the upside there as well.
I think it's interesting, Tej, because just thinking about some of the things that you mentioned, it also brings about how much we should trust the quote rookie quarterbacks. And I think there's 2 really interesting situations here with JJ McCarthy and with Michael Penix Jr. And with Cam Ward to a certain degree as well. I think last year people really were able to chase variance by going after a rookie Jaden Daniels, who everyone knew was going to be able to run a lot. He ended up winning some leagues for some people. But this year, it doesn't necessarily feel that that's the case, unless you believe that Michael Penix has really good weapons around him. And we know that JJ McCarthy has really good weapons around him. And so what are your kind of data-based assumptions about the distributions of those 2 players, given that we don't expect them to have a lot of rushing upside? In particular, we expect Michael Penix to have probably no rushing upside, but we know to a certain degree that Drake London is a top wide receiver in this league. We know that Jay Jettas is a top wide receiver in this league, and we know that their wide receiver twos are both really good should they play.
Yeah, I mean that's like going to be super fascinating to follow this year is how Penix and JJ McCarthy look in their offenses, because we saw some efficient play out of both Darnold and Cousins for like the first 10 weeks last season. Darnold made it continue a little bit longer. Cousins obviously fell off. So like there is a lot of opportunity in both of their offenses. And I think I do like when you already have like an established quarterback, like one of the top 10 guys that we just talked about, taking one of those guys with very high variance is nice to just pair in your quarterback room. Like I like taking like some JJ McCarthy over like Trevor Lawrence, for example, where like they're being drafted in the same range, and Trevor Lawrence has a higher chance of finishing as a top 14 quarterback, but JJ McCarthy probably has a higher chance of finishing as a top 10 quarterback or top 7 quarterback, just because like we don't know what he's going to look like in the offense. We have a general idea of what Trevor Lawrence is going to look like, though.
So you're essentially in that range. You're saying you're trying to figure out whose ceiling is capped,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Exactly. Yeah,
that's an interesting way of discussing Trevor Lawrence. You think his ceiling is capped?
I think like when you look at someone like Trevor Lawrence or Tua, who's like kind of going in that same range, CJ Stroud as well in that same range, like we kind of know what those quarterbacks are at this point. And we know what their offensive supporting casts are, relative to as much confidence as we can have this time of the year. I think like when it comes to Penix and JJ McCarthy, like we have no idea how they're going to look, on the field. Like JJ McCarthy could play as like the 32nd best quarterback in the league all the way up to, maybe like the 7th best quarterback in the league this year as his range of outcomes. And so like, I fully want to lean into that. Like maybe he plays the first 4 weeks and he just looks awful and you drop him and pick up, Russell Wilson if he's on the waiver wire or something, just to get like another quarterback in there. But like, I'm totally fine later in late rounds, just leaning into as much variance as I can.
Who are some other guys between the two of you that you think kind of pop in terms of maybe you're going in the wrong spots?
It's been really interesting to distill like kind of which players have been going too early or too late. There's been a couple players that have been really big on drafting just because like I think that there's like a lot of opportunity there. J.K. Dobbins is one of them in Denver, just like amazing offensive line. Like again, like when I do my rush share projections, he's someone that shows up pretty well just because like the base rate for RJ Harvey type running backs isn't super high. So, I've been really big on him this year. Sam mentioned Travion Henderson, who I think is like every fantasy analyst's favorite running back to draft this year, just because like there's so much opportunity there as well. And then like a deeper one is like Braylon Allen. Like I don't fully trust Breece Hall after his pretty low efficiency last year. Aaron Glenn has had some press conferences where he's kind of said it's like a 1A, 1B thing right now. So like it does seem like Braylon Allen will get his opportunity to show why he should be the starting running back. And I think there is an outside shot that he could be that by the end of the year.
I 100% agree. Who I was going to say was, I think that Breece Hall is a little bit overvalued, and I think Braylon Allen is a little bit of a sleeper. And I think you look at kind of the more high-level pattern recognition stuff that isn't necessarily super data-backed, and you look at what the Lions did, and it was always a 1-2 punch. And I think that if you look at Breece Hall and Braylon Allen, how they were used last year, Braylon Allen started to kind of get more carries by the end of the year. And I definitely agree on that. The other person I wanted to highlight, given all of our discussions at the running back position, has been Chase Brown as well. And I look at Chase Brown as someone who probably will have the volume that Tej has identified. Like, I don't know how much competition he really has on the Bengals team. But I also don't think he's going to be a major part of the passing game. And I also don't think he's like a go-to weapon at any point in that offensive scheme. And so I wonder if we talked about bringing on risk, particularly in the early rounds. And I wonder if he is not risky enough to take a swing on in the second or third round. You should be looking at riskier places in the third, second round at the running back position, just because I feel like he's pretty locked in as a lower target share guy, as a running back, as a certified third to fourth option on that offense, in a pass happy offense as well. And if you are going to take a ton of swings at rookie running backs throughout the middle and the late rounds, then sure, go with Chase Brown and kind of mix or diversify your risk. But that's another guy who I've been looking at, that when he is selected, I'm always thinking, man, that seems a little high, particularly if you're selecting some, either very risky guys at the top, or you're selecting low risk guys over and over again. Perhaps like a pairing with him and Tyreek Hill, I just don't necessarily know if I get, because you're dealing with guys who seem to have ceilings to a certain degree as it pertains to this year.
Speaking of spreading out the risk there. Yeah, he's interesting too, because even just like going to the narrative of how he gets better from last year, that would be the defense being much better and maybe creating closer game scripts potentially. Do we think that the defense got that much better in Cincinnati? They're talking about entertaining trades for Trey Hendrickson. So I don't know how different the script is going to look than it did last year, in which case you might be looking at a similar floor ceiling situation. I want to go back to the Braylon Allen, Breece Hall conversation. Breece Hall's always been somebody who's scared me, largely because there hasn't been a single year where I've looked at that offense and gone, that's going to be a good offense. And so that always scares me with the running back that's going that early. If you can't identify that it's obviously going to be a good game script offense for somebody. And I think I've actually undervalued him as a result, but I'm fine in some cases saying, I'll let someone else take the risk here. And if the risk pays off, good for you. But I'm also getting someone else in this tier that I feel strongly about, and that might also pay off. So you can be wrong about somebody, but be right strategically, because you're still checking that box with a different person that you feel more comfortable with. With regards to the Jets running backs this year, I looked up Justin Fields' history with running backs in Chicago, let's say, like going back to his time in Chicago. He's never had a running back average more than 11 points per game. And that was David Montgomery, who we know is a pretty good running back. So I'm wondering the way that offense looks different if they have a lot of design quarterback runs, what that even means for the running back position there at all. And if you are not starting with a capped ceiling just because of who the quarterback is.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at the Jets backfield, like I do think that is a fair point about just like how much volume can the RB1 for them end up actually getting. But I have been really big on this. I think Sam has been as well. Like I think the run is going to be established so hard with the Jets this year. Like they're going to go all in on running the ball. They've made the investments in the offensive line. They brought in, a mobile quarterback that's going to have gravity in the run game. And so when I want to get a piece of that backfield, just because I think that they're going to have the lowest or second lowest pass rate over expected in the league this year, I'm just looking towards the guy that, had a higher EPA per rush success rate and lower tackle for loss rate last year in Braylon Allen over Breece Hall.
Yeah, and I think if you want to pick up on the data points, particularly if you're looking historicals that other people may not necessarily pick up on, the Saints, led by Clint Kubiak, were one of the lowest pass rate over expected teams, meaning they were running a lot more than expected. Clint Kubiak is now in Seattle, and I think Kenneth Walker may be a little undervalued as a result. Obviously, I think they could go with the committee with Charbonnet as well. However, they are really going to be establishing the run. So if you want to buy in on teams, as Tej said, he's buying in on the Jets, who the run will be established. I think the Seattle Seahawks are a major one. And especially given in the past years when we've been, quote, let down by Kenneth Walker, especially given last year where the Seahawks were one of the highest pass rate expected, over expected teams, meaning they were passing way more than people expected them to. I think that's a probably good bet on a little data point that people might not necessarily pick up on. So Tej, I've two kind of final questions for you, and they're real quick about defenses and kickers. So, and they both have to do with coaching. So do you believe that a defensive coordinator can optimize their defense to get turnovers. And I think the key ones that implies this year is the Denver Broncos, the Minnesota Vikings, and then we mentioned slightly the Seattle Seahawks. Do you think that you could potentially get alpha in drafting the Seattle Seahawks defense, should you have to draft a defense with your 11th or 12th pick or whatever, given that they are defense 10 and you can just wait until your final pick to get them and know that Mike McDonald is probably going to generate turnovers just as a kind of trickeration of the defense?
You can definitely predict that the Seahawks defense will probably generate more turnovers than the average defense, but the confidence in that prediction is not going to be super high because of how random defense is year to year and how random turnovers are year to year. In terms of just like, if you were to project out like the amount of interceptions that every team in the league will have, the distribution will be very narrow, just because it's hard to have a lot of confidence in those projections. Whereas like when you project out receptions, for example, the distribution is like very, very wide, because you can have more confidence in those predictions.
And then on the backside of that, let's focus on the offense. Kickers. Do you think that you could target teams that don't go for it on fourth more and are more likely to be kicking, and thus their kickers may have more points from making kicks?
That's actually a very good point that I didn't think about. Like I think about like with like Boswell, for example, where like
that was the one that came to mind
tend
with
to be
me as well.
conservative, right? Like actually I would totally be in for that. Yeah. That's a great idea.
All right. Tej Seth, who you can find on all of the socials at Tej, TEJ, FB Analytics. Sam Bruchhaus is Sam Bruchhaus. Go find them for more of their data-driven analysis that will also point you in the direction of drafting the right fantasy teams. Guys, looking forward to following all of this season, seeing if we're right about the RB at the top.
It's a big bet.
We got through this whole show without mentioning Kyle Pitts once. I think that's pretty impressive.
Thank God.
Did we now, or did you just mention him, which means that I have to follow up with Sammy B? You put that tweet out. Are you actually going to draft Kyle Pitts?
No. In fact, but I do have him on my like flagged waiver wire. I do have him, but just
waiver
because,
wire.
Yeah, he didn't even go in our draft. Or in any of our drafts, really. He's like on the
he
waivers.
Hasn't been being drafted, I don't think, that often. Yeah.
He's like tight end 19.
Yeah.
10-team league. He's like out of it pretty deeply.
But does that makes sense to me? Because even if it were to turn around, like the positives with Kyle Pitts is the fact that he is a tight end one with a role in the passing game. The problem is that he doesn't appear to have established that he is good enough to demand targets. So I can't count on him getting the ball, regardless of whether or not Mooney is on the field and we've just had too many different examples of various offenses there, and he still isn't getting it done.
What's interesting to me is that I think he's been so overvalued, and I think the core part of that comes from his draft, like the draft assets spent on him.
Absolutely.
That as a result, he has underperformed. Like you look at his yards per route run, his target share, like he's like slightly above average. He had a pretty good year his first year. If it was really anyone else, we probably wouldn't have thought about it. But when you're a tight end selected with a top 10 pick and then touted as a guy who could potentially be a wide receiver one or a pass catcher one, it just kind of really changes the calculus of what people think about you. And I think at this point, like the best part about Kyle Pitts is that people on the internet really like to talk about him.
Yes. No, that is true. I mean, he has become like the quintessential fantasy meme at this point. Like, I think I get someone sending me a Kyle Pitts fantasy meme like almost every day. I love it. Keep sending them to me. Like they're all so funny.
Is there a chance that his ceiling changes at this stage of the game?
It's unlikely.
I'd be shocked, but like the whole point of why I tried to highlight it was because like the gears are there. The changes are there. I just don't know if it's in the cards at this point, 3 years in.
Our issue with him is that the gears are always there. The changes are always there, and then he still doesn't produce regardless of that. We keep looking for upside. I think to your point, if he was a guy who was undrafted and had this role in the offense, then we would see value to him attached to him for where he's going in drafts now. But the problem is that we keep bumping him up in drafts, projecting some sort of unseen ceiling. Like it might happen this year because we thought it was going to happen originally and it's never happened. So we keep assigning this potential to him that might just not be there. So we're not looking at the floor anymore. I don't know. Okay. Good stuff, guys. Thank you so much for your analysis. Go follow Sam and Tej everywhere you can. And we'll be back next week for actually, we're going to be back later this week with a lot of content because Sam and I are going to a fantasy football event. And so we'll be putting out content all week that is fantasy football related. Be sure to follow along for that at SumerSports everywhere on the social media. We'll be back with another edition of the SumerSports Show next week.